Is this the British way or the Nazi way? That was in a letter from a Mau Mau detainee to the British Parliament. Unfortunately, the world turned a blind eye to his letter because a liberal program that was meant to rehabilitate people was enough for them to turn a blind eye to the dehumanization of people in a corner of the world they did not consider their own.
Hi, my name is Ngina.
And I'm Mehek.
And we are the Disruptors. And welcome to Season 2, The Hanged. Just a trigger warning to all those who are listening or watching. This episode contains events of violence, trauma, and torture. Listener discretion is advised. So let's go back to the beginning. Just before we get back to Kenya, I'd like to take people back to the Soviet days, the Nazi days, and give you guys just a little description of what it was like. So, wow. The Soviet gulags, which actually we get to have the British gulags in Kenya. So the Soviet gulags main purpose, first of all, they were established under Lenin and they expanded massively under Stalin, obviously. And they were basically forced labor camps. And the main purpose of this was to punish political dissenters, class enemies, common criminals, and minority ethnic groups. Another thing, they were also meant to fuel rapid industrialization by obviously providing free labor in mines, forests, railroads, and factories. Then let's go to the Nazi concentration camps. Everyone knows about the Nazi concentration camps. They were built under Adolf Hitler's regime in 1933 to 1945, basically during the World War II. And these camps served a different purpose, but very terrifying. The purpose was for racial extermination, for lack of a better word. And they aimed to realizing the final solution to the systemic extermination of the Europe's Jewish population. So just a few facts about the Nazi concentration camps. There are different types. There's concentration camps for political prisoners. There was extermination camps for industrialized mass murder. There were labor camps used for Jews, Slavs, and others for factory or infrastructure work. And there were over 17 million victims, which includes 6 million Jews, 2 to 3 million members of the Soviet, 250,000 Roma, 200,000 disabled persons, thousands of clergy, the LGBTQ plus people, and descendants, of course. Of course, the conditions were mass starvation, daily beatings, forced labor, medical experiments, public executions. And under the medical experiments, there was psychological abuse.
And physical mutilation as well.
And then, of course, in extermination camps, victims were stripped, shaved, hardened into gas chambers, then cremated. This is something that will come back to Kenya. And Caroline Elkins, the writer of the British Gulags, they argue that the British detention camps in Kenya, they bore resemblance to both of the systems. So both the Soviet Gulags and the concentration camps. From the Soviet Gulags, there was the barbed wire villages, forced labor, ideological re-education, something that we will be debunking as we go on in this episode. And then from the Nazi camps, there was systemic torture, mass executions, and ethnic targeting. In our case, there was the ethnic targeting of the Kikuyu people. That was the largest number, but there are also members from the Meru community, Kamba community, Embu communities, and other different communities in the country. So now let's get back into Kenya. So you can imagine this is after the state of emergency has happened. Jock Scott operation is done. Then comes, so with the Jock Scott, of course, the white settlers feel like Baring is not doing enough to protect us. And so pseudo gangs come up. And they're actually led by a man called Ian Henderson.
Keep that name in mind.
Yes. Ian Henderson is actually, in this sense, we can say he's already Kenyan because he's lived in Kenya. he speaks the language. He speaks Kikuyu.
Mm-hmm.
And so pseudo gangs come in and basically they had a shoot to kill. It was like a shoot to kill kind of order. To them, they were protecting their homes, their
Mm-hmm.
land. So it's like, if you show up on my land, I'm shooting you. Sounds familiar?
Way too familiar.
Yeah. And so these people basically took justice in their own hands.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it was like for Kenyans. So pseudo gangs come up, and it's actually Ian Henderson he had an average
Mm-hmm.
of killing 22 insurgents every week.
Every week.
Every week, he would kill at least 22. And he's actually given all these medals for how cruel he was. Imagine being given a medal for how cruel you are. Anyway, so of course there's a pseudo gangs going on. People are being arrested, whether you're Mau Mau or not, no, whether you're part of the Kenya Land and
Mm-hmm.
Freedom Army or not. And so it brings in issues like the pipeline, which Mehek will be taking us through, and the profiling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So, as Gina has mentioned, the 1950s were a crazy time, right? There was anarchy pretty much everywhere in terms of the white settlers, but not just them. We had, as we mentioned in one of our previous episodes, we had the white settlers who were like, oh, you're not doing enough for us, so we're going to take up arms. Then we had loyalists who were like, these guys, there's actually a loyalist who said they're ruining everything for us. So they sided with the white people. And it was just not a good time to be, first of all, to be Kikuyu, because that was the majority and that's who they targeted the most. It was also just not a good time to be Kenyan at that point because you were being rounded up. So we had an instance of already we had Operation Jock Scott, the emergency was declared, and there was a huge deportation that was going on actually. So we know that Jomo Kenyatta and about 180 other Mau Mau leaders were rounded up during that day. But that was not where it stopped. There was a massive thing where the British would go get people. Kikuyus probably living on European land, which used to be their land, by the way. So it's kind of weird to say people are squatting on no land, but whatever. So they would go get these squatters and take them to the reserves, which was basically areas they had carved out for the Kikuyus when they were taking up their farms and stuff. And what would happen was they couldn't just send people to these reserves. I mean, they would send women and children to the reserves without much questioning, but they couldn't just, oh yeah, I'm taking you out of Nairobi and putting you somewhere, let's say in Embu or at Fort Hall or at Thompson Falls. That's not how it worked. So a process came about called the screening process. So at the very early days, we had, of course, Baring, but then there was his good friend, General Erskine. Quick note, he was besties with Winston Churchill. And
Who also plays a key role.
And he had a paper that basically said he could enact martial law anytime he wanted. And he was he used to put it in his glass case, in his spectacles case. And if someone pissed him off, he'd open the case to give a warning because everyone knew.
Yeah.
So Erskine wasn't that nice of a guy either. But basically, Baring and Erskine came up with this whole thing that these people that we're rounding up and sending to reserves, we need to screen them. And we're going to divide them into two classes. So these are just the first two classes. So class one was basically, we have enough to indict them. We can send them over to these reserves or to these screening centers. Or there was class two where there wasn't much. However, there were still people that they could directly send to the reserves. So it didn't matter what you were, who you were going to be interrogated at some point.
Yeah.
And the screening process was, when you hear the word screening, right? If someone comes to me and tells me, hey, we have to screen you, I'm immediately going to think it's a security screening, right? Hey, empty your pockets, show me your bags, take all your stuff, go get out of here.
Why are you in the country? Such.
Exactly, right? That's not what a British screening was. The screening was so horrific that to this day, when you speak to Mau Mau veterans or anyone who underwent the British screening process, they have not translated it into their language at all. They will slow down and enunciate the word in a British accent because there was no other way to describe the horrors they went through. The screening was, in theory, and actually also in practice to a degree, a question and answer. They would interrogate you, basically. They call people in, they rounded you up. You are basically accused of being Mau Mau, or at least having some form of affiliation with the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And then you would be questioned. But there is a Mau Mau veteran who would go ahead and say, it was not just questioning. To be screened meant to be beaten. And again, just if you cannot hear this, I would just suggest to skip. But the screening was not only, hey, have you taken the oath? Do you know anyone who's taken the oath? And do you know any of the oath keepers? It involved a lot of torture and harassment. And these torture and harassment came about in the form of white people basically putting out their cigarettes on men's backs. They would break bottles and put them up the private parts of women and men. They would use flowers, banana leaves, even just beeswax. And a lot of this screening, a lot of this torture was a lot of mental and physical abuse. Physical abuse that was actually concentrated on sexual abuse. So using sexual abuse as some form of power tool, right? To get information from these people. And it came to a point where some people would end up just confessing everything because the pain was too great. One veteran who underwent screening said the pain was so unbearable. They would put banana leaves up her private parts. They used pliers on her breasts, and they would beat her. And the pain was so great, she just said whatever came to her mind. But this was just the beginning of the screening process. Unfortunately, it's not where it ends. So we had the screening, and once you were screened, basically you were sent back to the reserves. The problem was the reserves were already overflowing. So a lot of these screening centers ended up becoming holding cells in a sense to hold these people until they had the time to go into the reserves, until there was space in the reserves, or until the British came up with a place to take them. So in a way, this is where now the transit camps started to evolve from. And Thompson Falls actually becomes one of those transit camps. When it comes to screening, Langata became one of the biggest screening camps. So if you were arrested and you weren't going to the reserves directly, the chances of you going to Langata were very high. And Langata would end up becoming one of the biggest camps because where am I taking these people? They're staying in Langata. And as Gina had described, Langata would be one of the places with, barbed fences, people being penned in like their herds. And you would think that the screenings would only happen at official screening centers. Not so fun fact, there were only 15 officially sanctioned screening centers under the colonial government. There were 100 more illegal ones. And each one of these would end up transforming either into a holding camp, a transit camp, an extermination camp, or a labor camp that we'll get into ahead. But these screenings did not only happen in camps. Like we said, the whites were pretty much like, you're not doing enough. We're going to do this on our own because these people are scary.
Yeah.
So they had mobile screening camps. Do you know how we have mobile medical camps? Now imagine someone taking his car and putting people at the back, like, okay, we're going to go screen random people squatting on our farms across the highlands. An example is of someone who was known by the locals as Dr. Bunny. And he had a very scary nickname. His nickname was the Joseph Mengele of Kenya. For those of you in any way who know history, you know Joseph Mengele, you know Nazi Germany. The man was one of the reasons why the extermination chambers existed. He was known to experiment with anyone that came in the camps. So if Dr. Bunny, first of all, Bunny, is being called Joseph Mengele of Kenya, you can imagine what he did. According to sources close to him, it was known that I'm already calling him Joseph Mengele. Dr. Bunny would basically go around the highlands if he suspected someone of being either Mau Mau or having any form of affiliation with the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, just if they looked like they would be, right? Racism.
Well,
he would screen them. And then this screening, basically, he would screen them, he would interrogate them with the people he is with, which were normally loyalists. And then they would be sent to screening centers and then they would put into camps.
Yeah.
So didn't matter where you are, even if you weren't arrested, someone would come and find you and screen you. And according to some people, Dr. Bunny was very well known for his experimental ways for his screening. Some of them included skinning people alive or burning them while they're alive. Yeah, no wonder he was being called Joseph Mengele, because if that's one of the first things that people say about him, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's not where it ends. Unfortunately, you think it ends there. It does not end there. So by around 1953, as we all know, the war is still going on in the forest, right? We have the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. We'll pretty much have the upper hand at this point because Bering and his men, Erskine and his men, have zero idea how to fight in a forest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, it definitely feels like, yes, these people have the upper hand. The British are losing this war. What do we do? So what Baring comes up with, in a very lovely idea, is that we should mount a psychological attack against these people. And I know if when you sit and read these things, you're like, how can we allow that, right? But the reason why this was allowed is because that notion was actually supported by a psychologist and two, a very respected Kenyan archaeologist. And let Gina get into that.
Yeah. So basically, the main reason for having this psychological attack is basically for psychiatric profiling, definitely, and to dehumanize the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army members or just Kenyan people in general. So first of all, the psychiatrist was called J.C. Carothers, and he's actually well known for his work during the World War II.
He was a quack.
Yes, it's called pseudoscience. It was fake science, let's just be honest. And he said what was happening in Kenya was a psychic epidemic, which already just sounds like some nonsense, but yeah. And then the archaeologist who supported this and basically said what is going on in Kenya is a cult.
Drum roll, name reveal.
Louis Leakey,
Yeah.
someone who we read in our history books as a very honorable man, supported this idea. So imagine these two people who, in a sense, are seen as heroes and members of the society, proper members of the society, come in. So the profiling was in 3 tags, 3 colors. So there was the white, gray, and black. So the white was seen as a mild mau mau, a mild threat. Then the gray were the ones who were moderate. And then the ones who had the black tag were seen as the
hardcore.
As the hardcore mau maus, the ones who've gone through all the oathing ceremonies. They can never... they're radicalized. They're fully radicalized. And the interesting thing about this profiling was that you could move from white to gray, gray to black, or black to gray, gray to white. Like you could be moved around according to how
the white people felt.
Yes, according to how they felt. And of course, with this psychological aspect, the torture also became psychological. And some of the people who actually faced a lot of psychological abuse were the women. For context, there was only one detention camp in Kenya that held women, which is the Committee.
Which is now a prison.
Yeah, which is now what we now know as Committee Prison was a detention camp for women only. And not only women, most of them, it is known that they were there with their kids. So there's even one that when she talks about it, in the British Gulag, she talks about how she was threatened. She was told that we're going to kill your husband. He's dead. And the 2-year-old baby was watching as she was being beaten up and being thrown from one officer to another. And by the time she's done, she actually sees that baby's dead body in front of her because, of course, a child will try run towards the mom. Yeah. So that was the kind of thing that was going on. And according to J.C. Carothers, what he was doing was trying to restore mental health. It's the same thing. I think the closest thing I could compare it to was what they were talking about, hysteria in women. So, yeah. So I would say, so they were talking about restoring mental health, rehabilitating them to go back into society. So this looks like re-education. So of course, with this torture, not only were they being told to admit that they've taken the oath, they were also being told to recount the oath. let it be known that yes, there are people who did recount the oath because of how painful these situations were, but most of them never did.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what we come to find out later is, as a form of resistance in the camps, they started administering oaths again.
So before we get into that, the psychologist, the quack psychologist, and Louis Leakey kind of bolstered the British propaganda, or the British feeling that these people are unstable to take care of themselves, to take care of the land that they're born on, and to take care of this country that they live in.
Yeah.
And to hear a psychologist say, oh, yeah, that's mental hysteria. And then for the reason why Louis Leakey's testimony, in a sense, or Louis Leakey's input becomes so important is because Louis Leakey was born and brought up in Kenya. The entire Leakey family were archaeologists born and brought up in Kenya. He spoke Kikuyu. He lived amongst Kikuyu communities. He was known for being able to speak to them and talk to them. And for him to come and say that the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, or as the Mau Mau, were basically a cult, saying that they were just evil men, first of all, validates what the British were already feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, it feels like such a huge stab in the back for the Kikuyus.
Yeah.
Because it clearly was
Definitely.
not what he made it out to be.
Mm.
And so having these two people, one who's a Kenyan who's interacted and speaks the language, and then we have this quack psychologist that everyone trusts, right? Come and say this, pretty much emboldened the guy who would create something called the pipeline. So a little bit of context of what's going on, right? There's a lot of historical context. Remember, Britain is a colony. It's a huge empire at this point, and they're doing their own things elsewhere in a very bad fashion. So in 1948, you will realize the script is the same. They declare a state of emergency where? In Malaya.
Mm-hmm.
They start implementing the same process of Soviet gulags and Nazi concentration camps where? In Malaya. This was all done under a general called Templar.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, his idea was we can teach them how to not be nationalists, to not demand for independence, and to be people who will be reformed, be rehabilitated, to come and help us in colonial Malaya.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they would be great people for the British economy, right?
Yeah.
So they followed the same
Script.
right? And they follow the same script here, which is ironic considering the British were the ones who went to free all the concentration camps in Nazi Germany.
Yep.
So for them to be like, yo, that's bad, and then take the same thing and do it not just in Malaya, but then to bring it home to Kenya. It's very hypocritical of them, if we're being honest.
And for context, imagine the World War II ended in 1945. In Malaya, it happens in 1948. Now in Kenya, 1952. Look at the difference.
So
it's weird.
Around this time, Baring, of course, he's looking at like, okay, how do we deal with this problem that we're facing? He's like, I have rounded up people. I have put them in camps. I've put them in reserves. I'm screening them. But what do I do now? What else can I do? And he actually reaches out to General Temple and he's like, your method seems to be working. Of course, it's going to seem like it's working.
British
And
propaganda.
he says, can we have some of your civil servants who can come in Kenya and implement and design something that we can use here as well? And General Templar was like, no. but send me one of your colonial officers and I will train them. And this is where Thomas Askwith comes into play, into the picture. So Thomas, I need to put this out there. Thomas was a little bit of a liberal guy. He was known to have created a socials club in Kenya called the Colors Social Club. So it meant anyone could come and mingle with one another. That does not excuse what he does next. So he goes off to Malaya in around 1946. Not 1946, around the 1950s. And he basically learns A to Z of how we can create a rehabilitation program. He comes back and he creates something called the pipeline. So the pipeline, first of all, is basically a system where, as Gina had put, your profile as either black, gray, or white, and you're put through different camps within the pipeline to rehabilitate you.
Yeah.
So basically, it was made to look like we are rehoming and re-educating these people and putting them to good use so that they do not go against the crown. So what would happen was in the pipeline, just to give you, as we explained, right? We have the black, the white, and the gray. So white was basically, like you said,
Mild.
not a threat.
Yeah.
They would still be screened. Just keep that in mind. You're still being screened and you're still being sent to the reserves. But at this point, they were now going to start sending people to camps. Because at the same time, they were like, we don't have space for these people. Where do we put them? And so you would find people who were whites would be sent to, maybe they would be let to go to the reserves. But again, the reserves were full. Or they would be sent to, they would not really be sent to camps, but they would be sent back to the reserves, never back to the urban center.
Mhm.
So you're picked up from the urban center, you're screened, they determine you're white, and they send you out.
Yeah.
But usually it was to the reserves, or some of these people would end up working with the British, kind of depended. The Grey, it's important to understand, the Grey were thought, okay, these guys are a threat to us, something can happen. And they would send them to work camps or labor camps. So I just want to preface that Bering is the one who was behind the creation of the labor camps and the work camps. This came about because of something called the Swinnerton Plan.
Yeah.
There was a guy called Swinnerton, and he basically said, oh, again, we can't trust these people to work on their own. And so we have to teach them how to take care of what they have. So what they would do is to legitimize what the screening and the pipeline actually was, to make it seem like, oh, we're doing a good thing. They would send people out into these labor camps, and they would be forced to either work on agricultural land or to create camps,
Other camps. Yeah.
to hold more people, even themselves.
Yeah.
Which I
Which
think is
ended up
crazy.
being a problem.
And so we had, so some of the most notable camps were Embakasi and Manyani. Embakasi is, the ones who were sent to Embakasi were the ones who made the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. So the airport is a result of colonial, of the pipeline, actually.
Yeah.
And then those who were hardcore, as we mentioned, who were called the blacks, which, by the way, the irony is not missed. The tongue in the racism is right there.
Yeah.
Saying those who are hardcore are black and those who are not are white is something else.
Mm.
So we had the torture camps. Now, these were proper torture camps, screening and torture camps. They were mostly in Manda. We had Kajiado and then Aguthi camp. And then, now I know we've spoken a lot about how a lot of people from Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru, because they were closely related, would be sent to these camps. However, it's important to note there were other tribes who were taking the oath as well. The Maasais are very well known to have taken the oath, so are the Kalenjins. So Maasai Kenya Land and Freedom members, army members, would be sent to places like Mara River or Takwa if they were found to be blacks. And these were very strenuous conditions to live in. So imagine this, you're being screened. If you're screened and you're found to be either one of these colors, you're either sent to a reserve, you're sent to a working camp, or you're sent to a torture camp, basically.
Basically.
At each of these places, you are still under this chance of being screened again. And by screening, I mean tortured again. The worst type of torture would take place, of course, where the hardcore were, because they were trying to beat the Mau Mau out of them. Askwith genuinely believed, because of what the psychologist and Louis Leakey had said as well, was that since these oaths were something that they had taken, these were something that were deeply spiritual to them. It was a must for them to denounce their oath, to say, yes, I took the oath, to go into the rehabilitation program. So if you were screened and you said, yes, I took the oath, you're then sent accordingly to either a labor camp or to a torture camp.
Yeah.
And Askwith was of the belief that now when they have denounced their oath, now they'll be able to revert back, be cleansed of their oath. Like we mentioned in the previous episode where there was a whole de-oathing process, which was very torturous. And to just give you, before we get into the resilient part of this, is the kind of torture that took place. People, first of all, I'll give you an example of a Guti camp, which is currently now a high school, but they still have some of the original structure left. It was a very small structure. Imagine, I can't even say a classroom. It's smaller than a classroom. No windows. The doors had 3 holes on them on the top side, and these would allow officers to look in. And scores of men would be cramped into these small rooms, no windows, and they were locked in.
Mm.
The roof had barbed wire on it, which can still be seen at some of these places. So to not allow them to escape. These were the conditions they had to live in. And somehow it was, like as Gina said, oh, you could be moved from being black to gray to white or white to gray to black. But it was never a choice made by the people who are actually captive. So it was never like I can work as hard enough as I can and I can prove to them that I'm actually not a hardcore supporter of the army, or I'm not even just that. I could just work hard and I would still not be demoted, or I'd still be sent to somewhere else. And this was all done by the whites. So if they felt like you were, you had those sentiments, it didn't matter if you did or you didn't, you would still be sent out. And that was the part about it that just becomes, people would hope, okay, maybe if I work hard enough, I would be able to go to maybe a working camp and then maybe go to a reserve, because then I'll be free, right? Or maybe if I'm hardcore and I work hard enough, I can be sent to one of the exile camps, which would mean an exile camp basically meant, oh, this is a final stage, I can get out of the pipeline. And that was never the case. People would come out of this traumatized. Some of them never made it out.
Yeah.
Askwith, as much as he was like, yeah, this program works. We're putting people in through a pipeline. They're going to come out as these civilized people who can, help society. That's not really what happened, right? So we would end up with so this is at any one point in time across all the camps in the country. So we're not only talking about the main ones. We're talking about Genya and Manyani and the ones near Savo, Fort Hall, the ones far off all the way in Manda Island, or the ones all the way up in Northeastern. You would realize that at any given point in time, there were at least 1.6 million people passing through the pipeline.
Yeah.
That's a huge number of people to be going through this. And each one of them faced torture. And it's not like, oh, I'm going there and I'm being screened. You're going into the pipeline and you're being treated like cattle. These people, okay. How many of you have watched those videos of sheep being dipped in those huge...
the cattle dips.
The cattle dips?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know how most people are like, that looks scary. Like it might be suffocating. Imagine that being done to human beings.
And that was a process to enter.
Anytime anyone entered into one of these camps, they would be put through these cattle dips, actual cattle dips, to rid these people of their disease and their sins. And then they would be given, a pair of shorts.
Yellow
shorts, a blanket, and a band with a number on it. Sounds familiar? Pretty sure it does.
Yeah. And even before you get into the solution, let's just start with the fact that when you're entering the camp, you're being beaten. You're not being beaten by a white man. You're being beaten by a fellow Kenyan who's now a home guard, a loyalist. Then when you're getting into it, you go into the solution. But even before you get into the solution, there's a sense of psychological torture. And this is something that it was simple words being put on top of the gates. I can give an example, and it's very similar to the Soviet and Nazi camps, where they would kill your hope.
Before you
enter, you just know, yes, I don't think I'll make it out of here, but it's okay. We're fighting for our land. Just an example, like in Kenya, the Ngenya camp, the words were labor and freedom. At Fort Hall, it said, abandon hope, all ye who enter camp. Just to give you a similarity, in the Soviet gulags, what was written was work makes you free. So you can imagine that's already psychological.
Yep.
And then now you're getting into the solution. And it needs to be noted, very many people drowned whenever they entered the solutions. I mean, that was a bit expected.
Yeah.
Another thing I need to remind everyone is, with all these things happening, the pseudo gangs and the mobile screenings are still going on. And these mobile screenings actually led to what we now know as a mobile gallows. And these mobile gallows actually there was a lot of mass hangings because of this. Apart from that, of course, people were also being killed in the camps with no trial. these people were never taken through trial, or even if they're taken through trial, you'll be put on death row. It was just a matter of you waiting. And most of the times, the people who were doing the hanging were again
Loyalists.
fellow
Kenyan.
Kenyans. Around at least 1,090 people have been killed. This is a number that with all the research we've done, we cannot find any court documents that actually talk about this, because most of those papers were destroyed
when the British were running
when
away.
the British were leaving the country, because they had to keep up the image. The reason why even Askin and all these people were trying to say that this channel is working, or whatever they're doing is working, is because they had to sell the story. It was PR. But now this leads to what we now know, resistance in the camps.
So, sorry, before we go to the resistance and camps, I know it feels like, oh yeah, they're doing screenings, they're sending people to reserves, they are creating camps. But they had another process as well, called the villagization process.
Oh yeah.
Which is just, they would have these homesteads. From the inside, they would look like a normal village. There are huts everywhere. There's a common ground for people to walk around, whatever it was.
It looks like a
normal homestead.
Yeah.
Then there's this huge watchtower at the perimeter.
And barbed wire.
Barbed wire. No, and it's not just barbed wire. They have barbed wire fences. Then they have a trench around those fences with spikes in them. Then they have more barbed wire.
Yeah.
And these villages were where they would usually send people. Mostly women and children would end up there if they weren't being sent to committee at that point. And these things were heavily monitored. And the pseudo gangs were known to go to these places as well.
Yeah, and kill people.
So imagine, there's nowhere to go for people. You're either sent to overcrowded reserves or you're sent to villages where you're treated like a prisoner. You're being told, no, it's a village you're staying, but you're being guarded by home guards. And home guards were all made up of Kenyan loyalists.
And if you don't die by the gun, you're either dying of typhoid because of the overcrowding.
Exactly.
No proper sanitation. And if you go to the villages, there's also a very high chance of you dying because, first of all, it's forced villagization. And there was a lot of starvation happening.
Exactly.
These people were not provided with the basic needs. So, yeah, there was so many ways. So you can imagine the number of people that died. Women, children, even men. And in the overcrowded camps, people would... There's an account of one man who was on death row. He ended up not dying, thank the Lord. He describes it as they did not have space to turn when they're sleeping. And sometimes they would wake up and the person sleeping next to you is dead because of suffocation. That's how bad it was.
And what did the British do? So everything was working just fine.
Yeah.
Just fine. All dandy, nothing bad.
But we are cleansing them of their psychosis.
Now,
is what they'd say.
The thing is, we know a number of these camps, the main camps at least. So the main camps would include places like Fort Hall, of course, right? Manyani, anything along, a lot of it was along the railway, by the way. Interesting thing to note. A lot of these were around the railway. A lot of it could be because of how best can you transport people from Nairobi to these camps.
Yeah.
So either you were taken away in special police vehicles, probably they used the train, which sounds really familiar. Or there's also accounts of when some of these places were so isolated, so out of the way, people had to go on marches.
Yeah.
Like you're already being tortured, then you're being sent on a march, and then you're going to be tortured more when you get there.
And the march is a single file line. Yeah. And when you're marching, you're still being beaten. So you wouldn't even make it to the other camp. And if you get to the other camp, because they were being built by people from other camps already, it's actually say that sometimes the new members would get sick because these people have already been there. Of course, they're going to spread all these sicknesses. So there were many outbreaks that were going on. But of course, it wasn't painted that way.
And it's just important to note now, before we move into the movement now within the camps, is that scores of veterans over the years from that time to independence to after have given account of what has happened. The reason why it was diminished was because oral history is not really considered much.
Yeah.
And the only reason why these things were felt legitimate was because of the Hanslope archives that were declassified quite a few years back. So yeah, we can move on.
Just to say on the Hanslope, one thing is found out that there was a secret memo by Baring that actually gave the people permission to torture all these people.
Yep.
So torture was an accepted policy in a sense. But let's get into the resistance within the camps, because of course there was the DO thing and them being forced, but they still had this drive to, in a sense, liberate the country. And so they would use letters, and these letters, they would pass messages using cigarette butts, which I find very interesting because they used to be tortured with the same things. Yeah. And then an example of the letters is what led to the papers like the Manyani Times, and they would be coded. And they would use coded language, including Kikuyu slang, to pass messages from one camp to another, or from the camps to the colonial, all the way to the colonial office in London. We actually have an example of Pio writing letters from Manda Island. Though within these camps as well, there used to be impromptu schooling by fellow detainees. And they used to be taught so many things, but of course, the main thing they were taught is Kikuyu history. And it was basically telling them whatever the European man is doing is very hypocritical. That's modern Christianity. And yeah, they are bad people and they're getting rid of our culture. There's nothing wrong with our culture. And now, of course, with this impromptu schooling, I mean, education always leads to a sense of pride. So it would bring in new oathing ceremonies. Another thing to note is, again, children did play a very huge role in the Kenya Land and Freedom Army movement. They would play again around these camps. They would get those letters, whether it's through the cigarette butts or smuggled papers, whatever happens, or just listening to what people are saying, and they would take it to other camps, or they would basically just spread the information. So that was the form of that was a resistance in camps. The people who were on death row, who ended up being released, and they talk of this to this day. Yeah, but the kind of torture, and I think I'm just going to read a few entries of people who've talked about their torture. So first of all, there's Paul Nzili. He was arrested in March 1957 and stripped, brutalized, then castrated with pliers at Embakasi camp. This is his testimony. I was taken to an open area. They tied my legs with chains. Luvai then approached me with a large pair of pliers and castrated me. He was taken unconscious to King George's Hospital. Afterwards, he has never been able to have children. This brings in the aspect of ethnic cleansing that they were trying to do. Arrested December 1952 on the 24th is Wambogo Wanyingi. She was tortured for 9 years. She actually described something that we'll be talking about in a later episode, the Hola massacre.
Yes.
All the 11 were killed with clubs. I lay unconscious with 11 corpses for 2 days. A European doctor noticed I was alive. He continues, when I was released, I found my father's land had been given to Kenyan collaborators. Diko Mutua was an oath taker, was arrested and castrated with pliers after being stripped, beaten, and restrained. They used a pair of pliers, tied, blindfolded. Everything bad was done to your testicles. Jane Mudhoni Mara. She was arrested in her mid-teens. A glass bottle was filled with boiling water. I felt completely and utterly violated. This crime cannot go unpunished and unforgotten. She was raped, basically. Margaret Nyaruai. They whipped me while naked, banana leaves inserted into vaginas and rectum, breast squeezed with pliers, hot eggs into vagina to force confession. I still have a lot of pain in my body even today. That is just some. So for most of these people, you can imagine what it is they went through and the kind of trauma they experienced to this date.
And I think it raises a question of who actually was uncivilized
Yeah,
that they were
exactly.
trying to peg. So I think I think that's all for today. We understand that it's a heavy one. In case we missed anything, do let us know. As usual, all our resources will be linked with our episode and also on our social media. We look forward to bringing you more of our history. Thank you so much for joining us. Um,
See you next time.
see you next time.